I'm super excited to be here today to chat about all of the latest and greatest when it comes to Gen AI and what the potential impact will be within regulatory affairs, as well as, in particular, the promo review cycle. I'm here today with Dan. And before we dig in, I just want to do a quick little disclaimer that any sort of opinions that are expressed in this presentation and on the following slides are solely of ourselves, the presenters, and not of our employers. To kick things off, I would like to do a brief round of intros. And Dan, I would love for you to share a little bit about your background being an expert on the regulatory affairs and promotional review side of things.
Sure. I have served as a regulatory attorney in the pharmaceutical and biotech space for over 17 years. And the large majority of the work I've done has been in advertising and promotional review. I've sat on in upwards of 35 ad promo review committees and launched
Nice.
over 20 products and product iterations. And I've really seen it all. I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. I've seen people passionately defending their pieces and doing everything they can to get their pieces to market.
All right, Dan. So I'm curious today, from all of your expertise across promo review, what have you seen be kind of the top 2 or 3 challenges that promo review teams face in their process?
Sure. I would say first and foremost, aligning on risk tolerance. You have a company-wide risk tolerance that has to be determined from the top. And then you have different brands that have individual tolerances, and each individual reviewer has a different approach and perspective. And it's about marrying all of those into a unified front where we could operate under a certain assumption for a given brand. And the other primary area that I think would be of value to discuss is just making sure that everyone is diligent in doing their specific role. So making sure that marketing takes the feedback of reviewers and implements it in each piece, so that we don't have to repeat what we presented before. It means reviewers reviewing everything on time. It means that the coordinator makes sure that the agenda isn't filled with pieces that don't really need discussion for the entire group, let's say. I think that if we address those process issues, it would go a long way.
The promo review process is definitely a complex process because it involves so many different stakeholders. So it sounds like, I'm curious to hear if you have examples of, teams or companies that you've worked with where you've really been seen some of these challenges and how you've tactically been able to kind of come in and organize across all of those different challenge areas, especially given that there are so many stakeholders involved.
I think it's about just transparency in process. If we take a principle-based approach and explain as reviewers to the project champions exactly where we're coming from, what's our rationale, what's our thinking behind choices and decisions that we're making, it goes a long way to determining, to helping them feel comfortable with where we come out, and to make compromises and land on something that everyone's comfortable with. But if it's just a matter of no, because I said so, it creates a kind of distrust and also a tension that makes it difficult to achieve business objectives.
And I'm curious, like within, kind of observing, from my understanding in talking to folks across the promo and MLR review process, is that sometimes these, meetings can get super, super lengthy. And I'm curious, digging into that, what, do you see there be opportunities around shortening those meetings or creating kind of a more streamlined process of the meeting itself? And like, why do you feel like some of these meetings sometimes can get really lengthy?
I think that's a great question. What I've found in my career is that if you give marketing an amount of time in a meeting. Let's say you dedicate 4 hours, they will fill up those 4 hours. And rightfully so. Their job is
Right.
ROI. It's making sure that the marketing materials are getting to market. And so if they have the opportunity and we're sitting there and reviewing pieces, yes, it's completely justified for them to do that. However, our lengthy meetings, the best use of resources, I personally don't think so. And that's something that I coach my clients on and implement for my clients, which is a much more streamlined approach. Meeting when it is necessary to meet. I like to advise that if there's a question that comes up that's strictly medically driven, legal and regulatory don't need to be in the room to have that sometimes hours long conversation about a medical topic. I think it's very important to structure the agendas in such a way that that the meetings are to address unanswered issues that require all of the participants in the meeting. Otherwise, it should be done offline. And I think you get a much more streamlined approach that cuts down on that unnecessary meeting time.
I like that perspective in terms of really being kind of intentional, it sounds like, for what is the objective of this meeting and who exactly are the right stakeholders to involve to make that meeting hopefully faster or just more streamlined from like a resourcing perspective. And
Absolutely.
I'm curious, like on the flip side of, so you might have weekly, bi-weekly cadences for these MLR review or promo review meetings, but then there's all of this time in between, right, that folks spend perhaps asynchronously reviewing different promotional materials, whether that's in Viva, right, or whatever the system of record might be. I'm curious, in digging into that for a minute of, where do you see the biggest hangups when it comes to async review? For example, is it, folks not tagging references correctly? Is it, certain folks forgetting to tag things just appropriately? Like, have you seen like buckets of patterns where there are those blockers?
Sure. The one thing I think you would, if you did a survey of reviewers, the one thing that is a pet peeve of ours collectively is when we provide feedback and then that feedback is not implemented consistently across all the pieces. So we have to go back and make the same comments again and again. I
Mm.
think that on the flip side, what you get from the marketing side is that sometimes reviewers, like I said before, don't provide a justification as to how they landed on something, which makes it very difficult to pivot and go in a different direction. And so I think it really comes down to just being diligent. If everyone does their job, stays in their lane, and makes sure that they come to the meeting prepared, or even does what they have to do up front so that there doesn't even have to be a meeting on that particular topic. I think diligence goes a really long way. And it also goes to something that's extremely important from my perspective, which is driving a culture of respect and collaboration in the room. If everyone is singularly minded that we are trying to achieve business objectives in a compliant way, if we all have that mentality and focus, and treat each other with respect, knowing that sometimes things could get heated, and because there's a passion to get the job done in the right way. To me, those have been my most successful meetings and teams, is when everyone is collaborating, in a respectful way.
Well, that's a really great segue, I think, into discussing where does AI play a role in this whole equation of enabling collaboration and transparency and kind of streamlining some of that process. So marketers are happy, with pushing the company objectives from their perspective, and then medical, legal, and regulatory is also, feels confident that compliance and the risk, tolerance, so to speak, is to the level that they're comfortable with. So I'm curious, I know at the beginning you mentioned that the initial response that you had to the concept of generative AI, which is the newer iteration that we're seeing in the AI field today, with ChatGPT. I'm curious, if you're open to, for the next like minute, sharing a little bit about why that response, and like what do you feel like was driving that response?
My response that I think that it'll take my job.
Yes. Well,
If
I think it's a response, that everyone, I mean, look, even I feel like in Silicon Valley, like all tech people had that visceral response as well. It's just been,
yeah.
it's like a collective pattern that we're all experiencing. And, I just feel like sharing, your experience, other people will be able to relate to that same feeling.
Oh, sure. And I think that really when you really dig down, the answer isn't that it will take your job. It's that if you embrace AI as a co-pilot, you will be at an advantage as compared to those who do not take on AI as a co-pilot, right? If you're using the technology, you're going to have a leg up. And I think that's a healthier way to look at it for now. I don't know what happens in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but for the moment, as a reviewer, I am going to be assisted by AI, which will result in me being more efficient and more effective. I can even give you some examples that just, off the top of my head, just automating repetitive tasks. Identifying potential compliance issues, unsubstantiated claims, misleading information. Like I said before, feedback that we've given, was that feedback implemented? All of these things are pretty straightforward for AI, and not something that's necessarily too difficult for it to capture, to be trained on and be able to capture those things. And it's providing instant feedback on that. So I don't have to go carefully dissecting every piece of the piece, if AI is doing that, but it cannot operate in a vacuum. It's not something that we could just let loose at this point. So it will help with accuracy and completeness and clarity of the pieces. But I'm not quite ready to hand over control just yet.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think from a risk and compliance standpoint, right? To fully let that control to a new technology that we don't quite even have like a full understanding of all of the different elements is definitely a high risk tolerance for a company to have to potentially do that. But I think with that and kind of going into a segue around generative AI, I wanted to just establish a little bit of just the basics around what this new technology is, because I also get a lot of questions around will AI take my job? And similar to you, when you think about Gen AI or any AI technology, it's really, how do you think it learns? It learns from humans, right? Good data in, good data
Yeah.
out. Bad data in, bad data out. So humans are going to be, us collectively are going to be a very integral part of making AI work effectively in a risk tolerant way. And by the definition, I feel like, of how it all works, in a lot of ways, it implies it being a co-pilot. You need the human in the loop to really guide the AI directionally in the right way. And I think what's really interesting, because another thing that I think is important to think about when it comes to generative AI is, why is generative AI different? Right. And really understanding the basics of it to even know how it can be, to your point, with the examples you shared, applied in the promo review process. And like a little bit of just context on generative AI is that, although generative AI really blew up with ChatGPT, call it November of 2022, when it grew to 1 million users in just 5 days, which is really unheard of, the technology that drove generative AI and products like ChatGPT, which is just one subsect of Gen AI. ChatGPT is not all of Gen AI.
Mhm.
So the entire tech actually came from a paper that was published back in 2017 from Google Research. So I mean, the technology supporting this has actually been around now for 6 years, which is in the tech scheme of things a very long time, but in the big scheme of things, it's a very short time, right? So it is quite a novel technology. And when you think about the fact that just 8 years ago, the FDA, for example, transitioned from physical submissions, like pen and paper submissions, to digital. That was just 8 years ago. That was 2 years before the tech came out for Gen AI, right? In certain respects, the industry has been slower to adopt it for very good reasons because of the risk, right? And compliance and security. But it's also really exciting technology. And the one thing I'll highlight that, and then we'll kind of segue into the different applications of it when it comes to promotional review, is that generative AI is really based on this concept of what's called a large language model. And we're going to get a little technical for the next 30 seconds just because it's important to understand. But large language models are inherently trained on language. So corpuses of massive text, right? So ChatGPT was, probably trained on everything on the web, right? And then when we think about promo review, maybe you want a large language model that's just trained on scientific promotional claims to understand what that looks like, right? And the reason why that's important to understand is when we start to think about what are the different applications, large language models are really great at, understanding language. And in particular, the second difference I would say with generative AI and historical AI models. So like AI has been around for a while, right? So we know that. So why is Gen AI different? Well, one other key difference is that kind of in previous waves of AI, I would say those models very much learned from like discrete units. So imagine if you're building a house and you're laying brick by brick by brick, it's like the model's looking at that brick and the previous brick and the previous brick, and it can predict the future brick, right? Whereas when we look at generative AI, the beauty of this kind of new model is that it's able to understand patterns and context. So it's much more intelligent in that way. So if we take our brick example, imagine I'm laying out brick, and then it's a blue brick and a green brick, and I laid out bricks in a circle, and I created this whole house with like all of these funky patterns. Well, generative AI inherently is able to understand those patterns, not just at the unit level like previous models. So that's probably, the other key difference to understand, and how all of this ultimately ties into the promotional review process, right? At least from my perspective as a technologist. And Dana, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts here, is that you have these models that are great at understanding language and patterns. So when we look at the promo review process, you could see platforms like generative AI be applied into looking at claims and understanding the context of that claim and trying to assess to the best of its ability whether that claim is validated by medical, evidence, or looking through previous comments. If you're a reviewer, right, and you just reviewed a piece, you left all of these comments and requested changes, a model can effectively look at that, look at a new document that was submitted, and try to compare. If Dan said that this change needs to be made, did this document actually have that change that was requested?
Yeah.
So I think to your point, enabling that like streamlining in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's absolutely where the benefit comes in. The idea that these models are now able to understand the nuances of medical and scientific language puts them in a position where they could really be at this point integrated into existing ad promo review workflows, which is near and dear to me. That's what gets me really excited about. Is just the process and optimizing that process. And AI is really, a significant part of that. I can't help but think that when I started my career in ad promo, we used paper. We used to get, a foot high paper stack, and that's how we reviewed it with a pencil. And then it was, 50% of big pharma is not even involved in social media. How could it be that they're not on social media? It's because we didn't have any guidance from FDA on that. And now we're talking about AI, being an integral part of the process. So it's like, when we explain to my kids that like we didn't have the internet or phones as when we were their age. So it's really exciting to be part of this. And it's, like you said, you need to make sure that there's high quality inputs to make sure that you get the high quality feedback. And that, so the training, I think the training is the most important thing to make sure that it's constantly learning what you want it to be learning. And just, continue to iterate and make sure that that it's getting the right feedback.
And I think that's really the beauty of it as well, to your point, where, if I'm a reviewer, whether I'm on the medical or regulatory side and I'm leveraging I can provide it the feedback. So that way, almost this AI assistant or co-pilot learns my methodology for
Mhm.
reviewing. So it almost can give you like these superpowers or like superhuman powers, but that are so personalized to you as the individual, as well as, to your earlier point about company risk policies. Like certain brands will have particular risk policies. There's the company policy, and then there's you as the individual and, what risk tolerance and framework you like to apply to. And I think it's, the beauty of AI is that it's able to adapt and personalize at all of these three levels.
It's interesting you say personalization because I think of it, the next level is that instead of, if we get to the point where AI is able to review something for me and really look at a number of details that normally I'd have to be scouring the piece to make sure all the details were correct, and now this is calling out those details for me. That enables me and my fellow reviewers to spend more time thinking strategically about pieces, which
Mm.
means that as a lawyer who's in the room and charging an hourly rate, you're able to utilize my skill set and expertise in a much more beneficial way to the company. If you think about it, over the course of a year, it varies based on company, but we review, let's call it 1,000 pieces. 1,000 pieces come through one product's review committee for a year. With AI, I think that the future of sales and marketing in pharma needs to be much more personalized. And I think that instead of hundreds or 1,000 pieces, think 10,000 pieces, where every piece is really tailored to the audience, to the caregiver, to the
Mm.
patient, to the specific doctor, to the region they're in, the specialty they're in, the patients that the sales rep is seeing that they're attending to. And if you think of it in terms of that, we should be able to drastically reduce the bottleneck in ad promo and open the door to that level of personalization and volume. And by bottleneck, I just mean that when you have extensive meetings and and you have you don't have necessarily the right stakeholders in the room, and you're focused on details that can be addressed with AI. I think it just opens up an entire new world, which is where we need to be headed anyway.
Exactly. No, I love that because, obviously modular content and omni-channel is a big talk when it comes to marketing and sales. And, to your point, producing that volume of pieces and also being able to get them through the promo review
Yeah,
process is one of the biggest bottlenecks that exists today. But directionally, even outside of pharma, right, this is where everything is going.
yeah.
And within pharma in particular, like that's going to become so much more critical. And a technology like AI, when used effectively, with alongside, right, a streamlined promo review process, can now really empower these companies to achieve the next level of personalization, which is so critical, right, to ultimately getting the right medicine to the right patients, through the right doctors at the right time.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I think that the future is bright because we have this technology that's going to help us push us there.
Curious, Dan, what we've talked about and covered a couple of examples of applications of AI within the promo review process. I'm curious if you have other tactical examples of where you see AI as a co-pilot be applied within the process.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of different areas. I have a couple off the top of my head. We spoke about feedback, right? If I provide feedback as a reviewer, I want to make sure that that feedback has been implemented. Is the right state, legal statement, disclaimer, footnote, footer, whatever I'm
Mhm.
giving input on, has that been consistently implemented across new pieces that we're seeing? But even beyond that, references could be a very time consuming operation, making sure that you annotate and highlight and get all the appropriate references. My understanding, upon seeing some demos with AI, is that it should be able to, greatly reduce the amount of time and effort for those tasks. What about taking FDA advisory comments, right? Going into a database, seeing every FDA comment that's been made on any piece, which is available, teaching the AI about that, and then being able to say, hey, this is similar language to something that the FDA called out. This is something that you should really be looking at. That to me is like mind blowing. The benefit of that kind of input, and how instant it is, that could go a really, really long way, in just giving us tools to be able to make this process so much more efficient. And then there's other applications like, let's say if it could draft your 2253 submissions, so that regulatory can now just review them instead of having to draft it from scratch. These are all things that I just think that, just make me very excited about the next, 3 to 5 years in this space. There's so much ground to be covered. And we don't, that's just the beginning of it. I think we can't even really envision what it truly will be able to do, beyond that. But I think as a start, if you had just those things, it would, be exponentially beneficial.
And I think with all of those examples, kind of the pattern and the theme of what you also mentioned earlier, which is, you have all of these highly expert, teammates and team members, right? Whether it's medical, regulatory, legal, marketing. And at the end of the day, how can AI be leveraged to enable all of those subject matter experts to leverage their subject matter expertise and really
Yeah.
focus on the strategic, the grade, the nuance, where the subject matter expertise matters most, as opposed to, being in the weeds of, did I format this correctly, which is important, but
Yeah.
those are the things that can be effectively assisted or semi-automated away using a technology. And I think that world is probably exciting to everyone, where it's like, oh, I get to focus on like the challenging, the gray and
Yeah.
the nuance versus, is the comma there or the period there, so to speak.
Yeah, and my philosophy has always been throughout my entire career. I want to say yes. I want to be able to help the business by letting them do what they're asking to do when they come to review committee. Most of the time, we're able to agree and get them to where they need to go. But there are some times where they come in with an interesting, initiative they want to try out, a concept, and it just can't work for whatever reason. But my goal has always been, if I have to say no, it's no, but here's an innovative way we could approach it. Here's some ways that maybe you didn't think about. Let me better understand where you're coming from, what your actual objective is. You want to do
Right.
this type of piece, but for what reason? Maybe we can do it in another way that works. And that's the exciting part of the job, to be able to really help the business, partner with them, sit, side by side, and achieve the objective. So to take my work, from where it includes that strategic side, but involves a lot of nitty gritty, review, of language, and push it more towards that strategy side of things, is something that I look forward to, frankly.
I think in a lot of ways AI can enable more of that. And that's how it kind of ties into fostering collaboration right? So that way there's less time spent on some of these things that can take away from enabling more of that collaborative mindset of no, but what's the objective and how do we move it forward?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I'm curious to hear your perspective as teams potentially consider integrating AI into their process. What do you feel like are, off the top of your head, important criteria to consider as you're evaluating? So like if you have vendors in front of you or you're considering like building your own AI model to, internally assist with that process, how would you look at bringing a technology like this into your team?
Well, I think first and foremost is accuracy. That is the most important thing to me. We're in a regulated industry that there's not room for error to submit something that's not factually accurate. It has to be truthful, not misleading, properly substantiated. So, like we talked about before, garbage in, garbage out. If you're not feeding the system with inputs and with feedback, and iterative feedback, to make sure that it is accurate in its review and in its whatever kind of material it's providing, then it'll just break down. That's not going to be of use to in this industry. So that to me is the absolute most important.
That makes sense. And to add to that, a couple of things that I'll say for folks who, from a technical perspective, from folks who might be considering whether it's a third party vendor or building out your own technology in-house, are probably 2 to 3 things. One, if you're thinking about building in-house versus outsourcing to a vendor, there's cost considerations, right? And the time involved and the expertise that you will need to bring in on the AI side to be able to really build a specialized model that's able to understand the nuances of promotional review specifically.
Sure.
Even within life sciences, there is, models that can do drug discovery, right? And generate novel molecules to go into R&D. It's a very different task set than
Sure.
what is required for the promo review process. So I think that's one thing. The second thing to think about, especially if you're talking with vendors and considering different ones, is to ask them questions around what type of models they use, because there's kind of two broad buckets that are important to consider. There's the more closed private model buckets, and then there's the open buckets. And closed buckets would include models like OpenAI, where it's a black box, right? Data goes in, you're not quite sure where it's stored, what happens to it, what's the flow, right? So those are more of the private, company AI models. And then there's the sect of more open models, which are open source. So that's like Facebook's Llama, Falcon. There's many out there. But the pro potentially of that approach is that there's a lot more explainability and kind of control, right? So when you work with a vendor that, for example, uses their own models that they train in-house, they're more likely to be able to explain the flow of data and have that control, which then leads into that regulatory and compliance side of things and giving the confidence that you as a company working with this vendor like knows what's happening behind the scenes. So I wanted to just highlight that because I know, with Chat GPT, like that's kind of taken over the world as like that is generative AI, but there's all of these different models and vendors applying them in different ways. And I think it's important, especially when we're talking about regulatory functions, to be very much aware of what is the technology that the vendors are using. So perhaps, I know everyone has IT teams and procurement teams. So I think it's important to bring folks internally who have that technical knowledge to be able to evaluate everything appropriately.
Yeah, and I think to your point, this isn't something that it's not going to be beneficial to just pummel it with every bit of information that's on the internet for these particular
Yes.
purposes, right? We are going to, like we talked about before, we are going to get the best out of this if it's fed, with our publications, with our label, with FDA advisory comments for our product and for other
Yes.
products. But that's pretty much it. That's the universe, right? Once you start going beyond that, then then who knows where it goes. And having an auditable trail of what data is in there and what's coming out, I think is going to be critically important.
Yeah, exactly. So I think overall it's really exciting opportunity for AI to, enable regulatory affairs and the promo review and the MLR review process in a lot of ways. And I feel like if we can really nail that, it's exciting because that's probably the most regulated part in a way of what a pharma company does. So well, thanks, Dan, for sharing your feedback on this. So, I know another piece of news that's come out recently when it comes to AI is Biden's new executive order on artificial intelligence. This came out probably fresh off the kitchen plate, so to speak, about a week and a half to 2 weeks ago. And I am excited to have you here to share your perspective on it. So I'm curious, what were your initial thoughts in reviewing the order?
Well, just by way of a little bit of background, this executive order outlines the White House's goals and principles for how AI should be developed and used in the United States. So it goes over some strategic direction and emphasizes important aspects that the White House feels is most important when tackling this issue, which is great. I think that putting out principles now is a great starting point. It's certainly not the be all end all. It's a statement of intent and a guide for government agencies to kind of drive the conversation from here on in. But we'll wait to see further developments to get some real teeth or legal power behind this executive order. My reading of it, I took away really 5 key points that the executive order is focusing on. One is safety. Just like in cars or medicine, you don't want AI to be dangerous. I think that's first and foremost in a lot of people's minds. Just making sure that it doesn't get out of control and it has the proper safeguards. Privacy. Obviously, your personal information is on there, and it's using a lot of data that we're inputting. And the order says that this data must be protected, which is completely reasonable. Fairness, making sure that AI doesn't treat people unfairly. The order wants AI to be fair and not discriminate, because of race or gender or any other protected class. Security. It says that it can be used for good things like protecting computer systems from hackers. But they want to make sure that it's used to keep data safe and secure. And lastly, it speaks about transparency and saying that people should understand how AI decisions are made. To your point, to what we discussed earlier, right? An auditable trail of how did we get here? And that's something that with open source, we haven't necessarily seen that, but when you get into specific use cases for regulated industries, that analysis changes and transparency becomes that much more important. So those are the high level, key points. And I think this is a great vision and direction. And now we'll have to wait and see how actual implementation and enforcement, goes into play.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm also very curious to see how the actual implementation of this order will go. From my tech perspective, at a high level, what my takeaways were from the order, to rip off of the 5 key things that you highlighted. I think one, it's really great to see the government focus resources on hiring AI expertise, because that was a big part also in conjunction with this executive order is that they launched this whole initiative publicly to recruit AI talent across their agencies. And that's critical, whether it's for national security to healthcare and any other piece of the government. I'm glad that they're putting resources towards that. It's at minimum bar none like a requirement. So I think that is the positive element of it. Another kind of specification of the EO more tactically was that they did specify regulatory requirements for models that carried a certain number of what they call floating point operations. So 10 to the 26 floating point operations for most models. But if you operate on biological data, which might be a little bit more relevant to life sciences, it's 10 to the 23rd floating point operations. I know that sounds like very, tactical in the weeds. The question that actually raises for me is why is that the marker, and like who determined that? I'd be very curious on the transparency of that decision, and I'm also very curious to see if that's a practical and how will that actually be implemented in the real world. I think the second kind of interesting question that this order raises, that's I think to be seen, is is the government regulating at the right layer? So for example, should we regulate the applications of AI? So if I come up with an AI model that creates biological weapons, like maybe we should regulate that application of it, or I use AI to assist in diagnosis for, the flu, like that should be regulated, right? Whether it's a software as a medical device or whatever it might be. Like to me, that as a technologist, that makes sense. And I get a little bit confused. And this is just kind of an initial response of, setting this regulatory blanket on AI as a technology, because it almost feels like we're regulating a calculator, like, or like an Excel spreadsheet, which kind of an AI model is effectively a calculator on steroids. Like that's effectively what it is. So I think, to your point, future legal cases, I think will be interesting in this space to really start to hone in and define like where exactly are we landing? Because I think we've started with such a broad blanket. I find it hard to believe from a technologist perspective that we're going to be able to figure all of it out and all of the details and nuances like over 180 days or whatever number of days the government has put in there for folks to figure that out. And then there was another thing that I was going to mention as well with the EO. I totally forgot. But yeah, I mean,
I actually was going to say something, so we could like create a pause here or whatever. I wanted to add that, yeah, to your point before, I think that this is great to see some guardrails put around it. But I think the government is best served to, like you said, get the right people in the room, hire experts in this, so that it's not just high level guidance that can't really be implemented. It has to be granular. There has to be a level of expertise and real inside knowledge of this to be able to properly put the real guardrails in place that will be meaningful. If it's too abstract, it's not going to have any weight to it. There's not going to be enough substance to make it worthwhile. And we all have an interest in getting this right. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I do think there's a fine balance of it's important for us to be aware and make sure that we are aware of what regulatory measures we might need to consider putting into place for certain applications of AI, but also in terms of providing clarity and guidance, which I also, kind of ironically feel like the sentiment perhaps with the FDA sometimes of, there's draft guidances on social media, but like, what does it tactically mean, right? What about these new platforms and how do we really interpret that? I feel like it's very similar, with this EO where it's this kind of draft guidance, in lay terms of the government's perspective on AI, but it raises a lot of questions, and I think that tactical guidance is a little bit still TBD. And then the
Yeah.
other point I'll add as well is, I think innovation is really important to also enable throughout all of this. And it'll be interesting to watch. And my concern is that certain enforcements that the government has defined, like this 10 to the 26 floating point operation, who knows where that came from? Who knows who lobbied it? Is that potentially going to have a detrimental impact on new technologies or startups who are in the space trying to innovate? And is that going to give regulatory capture to the larger folks? It's like if like a pharma company told the FDA, like, hey, when you're thinking about these guidances, like, consider these classifications for this type of drug when you approve versus other ones. So I don't, I'm just curious. I think this is where transparency is going to be important because, so far the government has not been clear yet, and hopefully they will be, around who came up with this random and arbitrary number and where that came from, and are they keeping objective, conflict of interest free folks that are contributing to this decision making?
Yeah, that makes one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that even if it takes time for the government to get to a point where we have very clear and comprehensive guidance, if ever, as to exactly how to approach this, we take a principle-based approach. When we were getting into social media, like I said before, pharma was late to the game because we didn't quite know the parameters, what we were allowed to do. But what we instructed our clients then is the same that I would advise today, which is that a principle-based approach. What would you do in print? Would you, whatever standards you would apply in a print ad, then let's apply those standards to social media. And you're going to get to a pretty good landing spot like that. It might not be perfect. There might be nuances and things that we do need some clarification on. But if we take a principle-based approach that we're responsible in the way that we approach things, we put ourselves in the best possible position. And it's the same thing here. Do we know every answer to how to implement AI responsibly? No, but if we use our principles that the company's founded on, and how we've addressed sales and marketing and advertising outside of AI, I think that will you could get to a very healthy landing spot for in the interim.
I really like that practical advice. And, I think in light of this executive order, taking a similar approach of, if, transparency, safety, privacy, lack of bias, or unbiasedness, so to speak, are critical criteria for us to watch for when it comes to AI models. How can we take that first principled approach, whether I'm a technologist, right, or I'm a pharma team considering integrating AI, and look at our solution from those different lenses and make our best, judgment based on company policy, team policy, and the EO around how we would integrate, implement an AI model or a technology in the process.
Yep, 100%.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Dan, for sharing your perspective on the promo review process. It's been a pleasure discussing all of the challenges. Will Gen AI take our jobs or not, and how to think about integrating Gen AI in a pretty high risk field. So thank you again for sharing your perspective.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure. I really look forward to the near term applications of the technology. Yeah, I've come around. I don't think it's going to take my job, but I do think that personally, I will really lay into this technology and do what I can to help drive the industry forward using generative AI. Because of all the benefits we spoke about, just at a baseline, just the idea of being able to put more of my time and effort into a strategic approach rather, than a little bit more granular nitty gritty, is going to go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.